There we go. You see it now? I mean, you got the presentation, right?
Yeah, we
So
have it.
real quick, I start out with sort of a hypothetical, which at this point is a little bit more obvious than it was when I started doing these about a year ago. And what would we do if we all saw another country have a certain set of actions I'm going to describe happen in rapid sequence? The rigging of legislative elections so that 99% of results were guaranteed, no matter what the voters did, and a minority retained power even if another party earned more votes. Or that group in power passed extreme laws that didn't reflect the people of their country. What if that party in power attacked the independent operations of elections and the very vote counting process to assert greater control over them? What if they attacked systematically the means by which the voters of the opposition party voted? Or they attacked protesters of the other party by criminalizing the way they chose to protest? Or if that entity attacked independent courts, or the elected will of their own electorate as expressed through referenda? Or what if that government attacked and simply ignored their own constitutions repeatedly, or changed the laws to protect themselves from being held accountable for corruption, or even went so far as to cleanse the history of their state, of their country, of elements that cast a bad light on what they were doing in the present day? This does happen. We see it happening around the world. We've seen it happening in history. We see it in Hungary. We see it to an extreme degree in Russia. When we see it elsewhere, we would see this as a sort of a nonstop assault on core underpinnings of democracy. We would say, my God, that country is losing its democracy. Well, the reason I wrote my book and the reason you're doing what you're doing is because everything I've just described is happening in state houses around this country right now. Not just two or three of the things I'm describing, all of them almost are happening in Columbus, Tallahassee, Austin, you name it, Madison, in rapid fire. But we don't see it as clearly as we would see it in another country. We don't see it because we're very overconfident in our own democracy. We sort of take it for granted. We have this privileged view that it just is intact no matter what. Number two, we like to focus in our own country on people like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Donald Trump and not on institutions. And third, the place where democracy is being attacked so ruthlessly is in state houses, which, unlike those in your group, is largely a place that we don't pay attention to. So all this is happening at one time, and for the most part, the media and most Americans just don't see it or treat it that way. And that's why I wrote my book, and that's why, to summarize the bottom line, it's the state house is stupid. That's where the attack on democracy is happening. Far more damage is being done by anonymous people in state houses like Arizona than by Marjorie Taylor Greene. Donald Trump's doing a lot of damage, but institutionally, these state houses are doing more damage. And if we don't focus on it, we're going to continue to lose ground when it comes to democracy. So why state houses? Why are they the place where this is happening? And I go through the book in great detail how they are really in many ways, the Achilles heel of American governance. Why is that? One, they are a place with a lot of power. They control almost everything we care about in politics, be it the economy, healthcare, education, energy, climate. Every issue we're debating right now, whether it be what's taught in schools or equality or gun reform or abortion access, all of that goes through state houses. And if you watch closely, most of the political activity that impacts these issues is not about Congress. It's about these state houses. So they have this immense power over almost every issue we care about and almost every issue in politics that we contest. They also, though, for good or for bad, right now for bad, have an incredible power over democracy itself. They write the rules about our elections, who votes, when they vote, how they register, how they're knocked off the rolls, how many drop boxes can you have? Can you have water at polls if you happen to have long lines? They do all that. That can be used for good or for very bad. It can shape the electorate at the end of the day. Number two, these state houses, as we all know, as we're learning painfully, they shape actually the districts themselves through the districting process. For the most part, that's still a state house responsibility. Well, that can be used to either create a competitive democracy where voters have a choice, or it can be used to lock up 99% of elections. So there's no choice. That's the power of these state houses. Number three, they have a major control of presidential electoral process. I won't go through that, but that's obviously a major concern as well. Donald Trump figured it out a little too late for his own ends, but that's a major issue. They also end up having major influence, and you see this in Arizona and Ohio. Oftentimes, a state house can run roughshod over other levels of government. In Arizona, Doug Ducey, in Ohio, Mike DeWine, they like to seem like they're more moderate, but these right-wing extreme state houses often run them over and have them behaving like far right wingers, or simply override them. And they end up cowering to these anonymous state house officials, even though they almost have an appearance of being more moderate. So they can run over statewide officials, they can trump federal government, a lot of issues, and they often run roughshod over local governments. They do it all the time in Ohio, be it over gun reform, be it over minimum wage, be it over, can you have plastic bags banned in the jurisdiction? So here we have these entities that are very powerful. They control democracy. They run over other officials. And here's the problem. No one knows anything about them. They have low profile elections. Media coverage of them is small, and it's diminishing as the media weakens. Often they're far away in state capitals. They have short sessions. So there's a real problem when you have entities with enormous power, but little notoriety, total anonymity. There's no accountability in such systems. So you have this major problem of that disconnect. That could all have been said, though, 20 years ago, that state houses had this problem. But it's gotten far worse. And by the way, I'm sorry, one other little factor. There are people who do know what these state houses do. They're camped out at state houses. A lot of them in places like Ohio are private interests seeking money from the government, seeking breaks, seeking lax regulation. They know, seeking extreme policies being pushed. They're in the face of these state house leaders, pushing for their agenda, paying attention, even while the people back home have no idea what's happening because they're largely anonymous. And all this has been sort of in the ether for a while. But then throw into this 2011 extreme gerrymandering, the most extreme gerrymandering we've seen in the history of our country, where state houses, you remember that year, 2 years after Obama won, we kind of dropped our guard and let them win a bunch of states. And in the 2011 gerrymandering cycle, they rigged elections through gerrymandering far more intensely than we've seen in the history of our country. And here's how extreme that gerrymander was. States like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, that were blue in both 8 and 12 because Obama won them both 8 and 12. You can see the apples to apples comparison of the gerrymandering impact in 8 and 12. When Obama won Ohio in 2008, we had 10 members of Congress that were Democrats and 8 that were Republican. We had 53 members of the state house that were Democrat, 46 Republican. A blue Ohio for Obama meant a blue Ohio for the legislatures. 4 years later, the gerrymandering totally reversed that, even though Obama won Ohio by almost the same amount. 10-8 became 4-12 the other way. 53-46 became 60-39 the other way. Same exact story in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. States that basically were blue in 12, who only 4 years ago had been blue on other levels when they were blue, were flipped the other way. The gerrymandering was so intense, even though the people spoke one way, the legislatures reflected the losing side's party. To make it worse, that gerrymandering was so effective that even in 2018, 8 years later, a blue wave in some of these states that catapulted sort of Nancy Pelosi back to power in those state houses, the gerrymandering was so effective that even when a majority of Wisconsinites and Pennsylvanians and Michigan voters voted for a Democrat decisively for their state house, the gerrymandering translated the Republican minority status into majority or supermajorities in their state houses. So it's again, go back to my initial slides. That Wisconsin outcome where Republicans lost by 9 but had 2/3 of the legislature, that's something Vladimir Putin or Orban would admire. A minority locking itself into supermajority status, no matter what the voters have done. It's even worse than that, though. And I caution, some of the opening parts I want to describe are quite negative. I promise I'll get to the good stuff at the end. Not only do they rig themselves a majority they do not earn at the polls. This slide shows you They actually have created a system where almost not a single member of their majorities ever face a real election. These are the margins of victory over 10 years of elections in Ohio, 62 seats, where 50 of those seats, if you go through the numbers here, average a 20% margin of victory or higher for 10 years. 38 of them, a 30% margin of victory for higher, and even the low is 12 or 10% margin of victory. We're talking about entire careers spent by almost every single member without a real election, without democracy, knowing that they never face accountability. And it turns out beyond just winning majorities they don't earn, it turns out that a decade, a generation of officials without real democracy, the incentive system that they live within is completely warped versus what we assume leads to good public service. You know, if you're in a competitive district, of course, your goal in life is to tell your voters to get reelected, hey, I delivered good public outcomes, you know, better schools, higher wages, better infrastructure. Please reelect me. You need to be able to do that to get reelected. If you're in a world where you never worry about your next election, of course, those public outcomes no longer matter. They're not part of your incentive system to get reelected because you're reelected no matter what. But far more important to you is actually going back to a couple slides. Oh, it's not going back. Go to the second one. You have a much bigger interest in serving private interests. They have a lot more to do with your future. Do you keep that energy utility happy? Do you keep a private for-profit school scam happy, even though it's undermining public schools in your district? Well, if the people back home can't get rid of you, but the for-profit school can determine if you're going to have a paid-for opponent in your primary, you're going to do more for that private interest than your public folks back home. The other thing that happens in these systems is, you know, in a competitive district, you worry about the mainstream values and beliefs of your voters. Because if you're an extremist, they'll vote you out. If you never worry about the general election, all of a sudden extremism really matters because it's the way to avoid the next primary. So the incentive is now to be an extremist. I won't go through all these for the sake of time, but once you commit yourself to a direction of serving private outcomes and not public outcomes, and to be an extremist and not mainstream, you also have another very powerful incentive, and it's 3 up from the bottom. And that's an incentive to attack democracy itself going forward. Because you know that if you've ever faced a competitive race in a robust democracy with an indefensible record of public outcomes and a record of being extremist, you would lose. So you cannot afford to have that be a future in for you. You've lived your entire career absent democracy. And if you introduce democracy into your own future, you'd lose. So of course, they keep rigging, they keep suppressing the vote. I won't go through all this in great detail, but I wish I were the first person to have observed this problem, and I'm not. Who's observed it? The Koch brothers, a group you all probably have heard of called ALEC. They understand everything I've described, and they've basically taken the incentives I've just described, the weaknesses of these state houses, and they've weaponized these state houses for their agenda. They basically know that if they've got an unpopular agenda and they want to get it done, and this is basically their agenda right here, and some other really negative things, the place to go is not Congress. It's not your mayor's office. It's typically not a governor's office. It's a place with all these screwed up incentives that lead to, I'm sorry to go back and forth, that won't let me reverse as far as I want to. It's going to the place that will do unpopular things, knowing it will never be held accountable, and willing to push private interests over the good of the public. If you want that, which the far right wants, your state house is the perfect place to go, and they figure that out. So I go through in my book. Sadly, they've been doing this for a lot longer than just the last couple of years. We like to think the attack on democracy began only a few years ago. It's been going on since Obama won, essentially. What have they learned? My book is called Laboratories of Autocracy, not just to have a cute title, but because they really are operating as laboratories. They learn from everything they do. They have learned, as I described before, that the popularity of an issue doesn't really matter. These politicians can and will push an issue that's deeply unpopular, knowing they can't be held accountable. In fact, what the people behind the scenes know is that the less popular an issue is, take it to your state house. That's why Mitch McConnell's telling Lindsey Graham not to bring up abortion. They can get it done through a state house where there won't be an election that anyone worries about. Number two, secrecy does matter, but mainly because it keeps donors hidden. The politicians honestly don't care that much. They have learned, number three, that legislators can overrun statewide officials. Number four, they've learned the more they throw forward to the state house at once, the better. If you have a weakened press corps and a limited scale of advocacy against you, the more you throw better at once, the better you do. Maybe a few things get controversial, a few things get a lot of attention, that gets all the press. In the meantime, a whole lot of other things go forward, no one even knows. That happens in Ohio and Tallahassee, in other states all the time. There's some issue gets all the attention, maybe it even gets defeated, which happens sometimes, but a whole lot of other things pass on through and hidden in a budget somewhere and no one even sees it. Number five, whether something succeeds or fails, they always learn. They always model. If the Don't Say Gay bill passes in Florida, weeks later, it's going to be in Ohio. That's exactly what happened. When Dobbs upheld abortion, every state was ready to go with something that looked the same. So they're always learning. If something gets struck down, they'll fix for the mistake. If something gets upheld, they'll all model after it. So they're always learning. If it feels like it's all coming quickly, it's because it is. They have 30 petri dishes or so. They're all doing similar things. They're always learning from their mistakes and failures. So it is accelerating. It feels like it is because it is. Number six, though, what have they learned? They have learned that unlike Democrats who are always looking for sort of the next rock star, the next Obama, the next, who knows who, famous, charismatic person, they don't care about that. All they want is people in these jobs who do what they are told. If the person has a scandal and has to resign, if a person is term limited, if a person has a heart attack, as long as those people have the same incentives leading to the same behavior, that's all they care about. And what they have seen in states like Ohio is if someone leaves the scene, the next person does the same thing, and that's what matters. And that's why their most important priority is this underlined sentence at the bottom. They must continue a system of lack of democracy, and then the behavior in the system always looks the same. And that's why part and parcel with everything I've described, to keep that all going, is an attack on democracy itself that never stops. This did not begin after the big lie. It began again after 08 and 10. It includes attacking the electorate that is a threat, like the Obama coalition was after 08. It includes attacking the way that electorate votes. It includes purging those votes and using voter ID to eliminate some of those votes. It includes attacking organized labor that funds the effort to get those voters out. Later in the decade, over between 2011 to 2020, it also meant that this group, and we didn't see this early in the decade, but by 16 and 18, they also began to undermine election outcomes themselves. A Democrat won the race of North Carolina governor. They immediately tried to strip powers from that governor. A Democrat won in Michigan. A Democrat won in Wisconsin. They began to go after the powers of these winners, even though they won a majority. And the legislators actually were in the minority. They began to try and strip away. It was the beginning of this attack on election outcomes. That's when they began to also just directly ignore, defy the results of citizen-led initiatives. In Florida, they said, we think people with felony records should get to vote, right? Well, the Florida legislature immediately started undermining the direct vote of their own people. In Maine and Missouri, they did things like Medicaid expansion. The state houses would just not fund them. Then they begin to try and make it harder to actually pass these initiatives in the first place. So they're really going from just simply voter suppression, gerrymandering. They begin to start attacking election outcomes themselves. What do they learn on the right? They learned it all worked. Sadly, it worked. They were good. They did effectively negate the Obama coalition in a state like Ohio, where Obama had won twice. And they also learned very sadly, partly because Democrats weren't tough enough, partly because our legal system doesn't respond quick enough, they learned that they were never held accountable. As far as they went, they never were held accountable. So of course they keep going. They've never been punished for going further, so they go further. And that brings us, and this is when I wrote the book, to 2021. 2021 was not the beginning of something. This isn't because of the big lie, which is kind of how the media treated it. This was simply an extension of a generation of attacking democracy to keep this sort of state house game going. They gerrymandered in 2021, just like they did in 2011. They doubled down on voting rights attacks. Attacks on the early vote in 2011, well, that became attacks on drop boxes in 2021, going after the voters of color in particular that they are threatened by. They could knock them out of power. And number three, they took the attacks on officials even further, beginning to attack elections officials they didn't like, beginning to go after judges and independent courts. 4, 5, and 6 are some new layers. They're legislating the big lie as if they don't know that it's a big lie. Most of them know that Donald Trump lost, but they're legislating as if they don't. They also are taking this very over-the-top step that you see in other countries, stoking vigilantism, trying to evade the review by courts, like that Texas law around abortion. And of course, it's really troubling. It's a 5-alarm fire to see them going after history itself and trying to censor it. All this, though, again, is part of a long-term attack by these state houses on democracy itself. So let me just close this very dark part before I get to the positives. Here's where we are right now. We basically like to think that there's a single battle in politics, but the truth is there are more than one battle. The two sides are fighting such different battles. I think we're better off seeing it that way versus just going through the typical red versus blue battle that we think of in our mind. The side on the left generally represents Democrats and the media. This side actually believes that democracy is intact. This side believes that it represents the mainstream of America, and for the most part, Democrats do. Americans are for Roe v. Wade. They're for common sense gun reform. They want to do something about climate change. They're for a middle-class based economy. They're not for banning books, on and on and on. So this side, understanding that and believing that democracy is intact, essentially chooses its battle to be a battle over elections on an assumed fair democratic playing field. And this side very quickly decides, well, if that's the battle, let's go win a bunch of federal elections and get what we want through federal wins. And then this side quickly decides, well, to do that, let's go win swing states to win the Senate, the House, and the presidency. And that's this side's battle. And this side gets especially excited in federal years. And when it wins those federal majorities, like it did in 20, presidency, 50 seats in the Senate and the House, this side celebrates like it's won its entire battle. Does that sound like a pretty accurate description? Federal, swing state, go get them. When you win those, you think you've won. All that would be really good if the other side's battle was the same battle, but it's not. The other side, going back to that early slide, they actually, first of all, understand that their viewpoint is not a majority viewpoint. They're under no illusions if you watch Mitch McConnell and Koch brothers. They know that what happened in Kansas is their fate, if there are straight up or down votes on abortion in most places. They know that their view, that's why, again, Mitch McConnell tells Lindsey Graham, don't bring it up in the Senate. He tells Rick Scott, don't bring up Social Security. That's not going to win us any elections. They know their minority viewpoint is, for the most part, not just unpopular, but toxic. But they also understand, unlike the side on the left, that democracy can actually be subverted. It's been that way in our own history. We see it in other countries. So what their battle is not a repeat. They know, in other words, if they had a repeated set of elections on their issues, they know they would lose. So what's their battle? Do they quit? No. Do they battle over elections like we do? No. They choose a different battle. It's over democracy itself. How can they avoid straight up elections as much as possible, avoiding the losses they just saw in Kansas and Alaska? Well, they do it by subverting democracy. And if that's your battle, where do you go? You go to state houses. You go to the laboratories of autocracy, because for all the reasons I've just described, those state houses control every issue they care about, but also democracy itself. So that's the place you can go if your goal is to put in a minority worldview in place over time. You can't do it through a repeated, robust democracy. You would lose, but you can do it through state houses. And that's what they're doing. And the call of action in my book, and you're doing this by doing what you're doing with Arizona and States Project, until the side on the left sees that we are in a battle for democracy itself, and that battle's front line is the state houses of this country, and the other positions at the state level that shape democracy, the side on the left will continue to lose the battle. And so once you see that you're in a battle for democracy itself, and that it is the state house is stupid, and I go through this in great detail in my book, there are some adjustments that are very obvious that we need to make, that you are making by being part of the Giving Circle. We must see the battle being for democracy itself in states. What are the things that come from that? There are 5 steps here. 1, the battle for democracy is a long battle. We have to get out of this simple cycle by cycle mentality that we build everything for November, then we quit for a year and a half. If we lose federally, we quit everything, we give up. If we win, we think we've won it all. John Lewis or the women's suffragists would tell you that is not what the battle for democracy is. It is a never-ending battle that we always have to contest. We can't judge everything on one cycle. We can't get hyped only for one cycle. It's longer than that. And my best example of that is Stacey Abrams in Georgia. She didn't get excited or quit after one cycle because they didn't win a Senate seat or something. She knew it was a long battle. She thought it was a long battle. And look what happened after 20 years of her doing that. Georgia finally turned blue because of all the things she did. You're in this, I know, for the same reason. You're not going to just stop working after November, whatever happens. It's a long battle. You have to, they're fighting it long term. They've been fighting it for long term for decades. We've got to do the same. Secondly, and you'll like this, it's a 50-state battle. Once you realize you're in a battle for democracy itself, it's not good enough to just fight for democracy in a few swing states because of the federal map. That's just wrong. As a matter of our Constitution, everyone deserves to live in a state, be it red or blue, that actually reflects the people of that state. That's a constitutional guarantee. But secondly, you never know where you're going to win if you don't fight, like Kansas. And so when you decide not to fight in a lot of places because it's not part of your little federal map, you lose in places you could have won, especially when they're being so extreme. And third, even if you don't win in those places, if you're running somewhere and fighting, you're at least holding extremists accountable. You're providing a cross pressure against it. If you don't fight in those places, extremism calcifies and explodes. So we have to get out of this federal swing state mentality that's having, once you see we're in a battle for democracy, you see how damaging it is that we are leaving dozens of states basically uncontested because we think they don't meet our federal formula for a swing state. It's a terribly damaging, failing strategy. Number 3, and this is again what you're doing in Arizona, once you see it's a 50-state battle, you better get at the state house level. That's where it starts. Yes, we want Mark Kelly to win. We can't let Mark Fincham win, but we've got to be smart enough to see that their strategy runs through state houses first and foremost. And we must battle that battle and that's got to be our front line too. It's your front line, which is great. It's not the front line enough yet of Joe Biden or of US senators. They've got to make it their front line as well. This is a little bit edgier, but just like we have to compete in every state, I also think we have to change our mindset so that we're competing in every district of every state. We can't allow, and this is a longer term thing we've got to work on, and on a different session we can talk about this. We allow dozens of districts in every state of this country to go uncontested. Millions of people are never hearing from the other side about what their state house is doing. Just like it's a disaster to not compete in every state, leaving millions of Arizonans and Ohioans and Georgians in state house districts that no one runs in, or they're so underfunded they might as well not be running, only contributes to what the state houses are doing. Lack of transparency, lack of accountability. We need to be running against the extremists everywhere. A, we could beat some of them, and B, so that there's some accountability back in the system and they don't get to live as extremists without ever being challenged. Number 4, once you see what's happening, you see that it's a mistake to make it only about Trump. This is not just about never Trump. The attack on democracy began before he ever ran. If he had admitted he lost the election fair and square, it would have continued. If he were locked up tomorrow, it will continue. And when we make it only about Trump, we're giving cover to too many other Republicans who are attacking democracy fiercely, in some ways more intelligently than he does. And we're literally telling people it's okay to vote for them because they're not like Trump. It's not okay. If they're attacking democracy, vote them out. And we have to be clear on that. And number 5, and I'll just close with this, although you don't need a pep talk on this. Once I hope people see that we're in a battle for democracy itself, my hope is they also see there is far more each person can do to lift democracy. You're doing it in what you are doing. You're saying, I'm not just giving a little bit of money or volunteering in my own neighborhood. I'm going to go adopt Arizona and help there. Other people can do it by saying, I belong to a homeless shelter board, or I'm a volunteer. I'm going to make sure my homeless shelter is registering voters, because those are the voters that are being purged every day. Other people who run a hair salon could be doing by registering their customers. High school kids can do it by getting seniors to get involved. The reason I bring all this up is the attack on democracy is full-time and it's big money. The protection of democracy is too often a fragment of our volunteer activity. And my worry is, against a full-time big money operation, if we don't scale up all that we're doing and figure out in our own footprint of influence in our life how to lift democracy in everything we do, we won't be scaling it up to the level it takes to fight back against this relentless profit-driven attack on democracy we're seeing. So I basically challenge people, think about all the things you could do. When I was a city council member, and I look back, I didn't think about how that I should be registering voters at every rec center or every library or every health clinic. I should have been. I just didn't think about it. We need to challenge everybody and ourselves. How can we all find within us a way to fight for democracy and everything I've described before, and fight a lot smarter for it, where we're not only focused on 5 or 6 swing Senate seats, but we're focused on the heart of democracy at the state house voter registration level. John Lewis was basically telling us this. So were so many of the civil rights leaders. Basically, as he's saying, freedom is an act. It's continuous action we all must take. When I read our civil rights leaders, so many of their quotes are literally telling us today what we have to do. So with that, I will stop talking. People ask me all the time, is it too late given everything I've said? Aren't we too far behind? The truth is, it's late. It's not too late. What we're doing with groups like yours in Michigan, what we're doing in other areas like Secretary of State races, if we weren't doing all these things, I greatly worry it's too late. We have an enormous election in a couple months. And my hope is that we all learn enough to keep building in 24. So if we don't do anything differently, it may be too late. But if we all do more than what you're doing, I think we still have time to save the day. So with that, I'd love to open up any questions you guys might have. Thanks so much for listening to me. I hope that was still well presented, even though I'm using this little iPad.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to drop in our link for our giving circle for anybody that is feeling inspired. One of the things we know, because we had Melissa Walker talk to us a while. Is this not pasting? There we go. She talked about these are things where like a smaller amount of money can make a bigger difference compared to maybe some of the federal races. So we've committed to $1,000. We've raised over 500. I know we got a message. I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not, David. A message about a Democrat candidate that was uncontested for the Arizona State House that I guess got a different position and is still on the ballot because they didn't know this before, I guess, the deadline to submit. So now there's a big concerted effort right now from the state's project to do a big write-in campaign, and they want to make sure all Democrats know the right person to write in for that seat, because if everybody votes for the person on the ballot, the Democrat on the ballot who's uncontested, it won't count. So they want to make sure Democrats are all on the same page with who to use as a write-in ballot. So they did ask for a surge of donations. I think I got this alert on Friday. I'm not sure if you even got the information, David. And they sent me the info, and I said I do my best to get the word out and make sure everybody knows that that's a seat that we already hold that now could be in jeopardy. In Arizona, it needs help because I think right now Republicans are in the lead for the state house, and we need to at least get to a tie, if not get at least one seat ahead. But it definitely takes a lot of work.
Yeah, no, I don't know that much about that, but if it's the case I'm thinking of, like, it's horrible that someone wins the primary and quits on us. And I've written political thrillers on my side, and that's like a bad thriller plot that someone comes along and offers. I'm not saying that's what happened here, but like I have nightmares about what might be behind all that. But yeah, it's one other challenge. My hope is that despite that, you've got some wins at your back in Arizona with Kelly running strong. Fincham is so bad. I don't know. My guess is the governor's race is probably around tied. Hopefully that carries the day. But no, that was a really that was very frustrating. And I keep saying this, like, and I don't mean to sound like I'm on my high horse, but we need at all levels, the Democrats who step up to run need to be prepared for a fight for democracy. They have to. And if they're not prepared for it, I'm sorry, I don't mean to speak so close to this thing. If they're not prepared for it, they're not in the right place. I mean, we are in a absolute showdown over democracy itself. And let's say that guy in good faith, hey there, if he in good faith did that, like if he ran at first in good faith, like we do need to tell the people running, you are signing up for a battle, a historic battle, and we need to gird these candidates that they better be prepared. And right now, I think some of our failures when it comes to democracy are occurring because we have Democrats in positions of power that are not prepared to fight for it like they need to. That's obviously an extreme example, but we really need to, like this. I entered politics myself through a kind of a, just a commitment to public service. And back then it was different. And we need to tell people now, listen, you're signing up for a state house. You need to be ready to be you are on the front of democracy, and be ready, because that's what you're signing up for. And if you tell me you're not up to that, I'm going to find someone else, because it's that big. It's that sort of fraught right now, and the stakes are that big.
So then I see Catherine Cross has her hand up. Catherine?
Yeah, hi. I have a question about the redistricting. David, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really very illuminating for a lot of people. And I really don't think a lot of people are really aware of this. Your example of fighting at the federal level versus the state legislatures. But my question is around the redistricting. You showed examples of how the redistricting, impacted the voting in the 2008, 2010 area. And we just went through a redistricting process recently. And I wondered what your view is of how successful the recent redistricting was for Democrats, or are we really still behind in terms of that effort?
We're behind. I mean, they couldn't have done much of a more extreme gerrymander than they already did in 11. Some states like Michigan managed to pass some reforms that did take hold. Arizona too, by the way, for Congress. Here's the problem. They fight harder to gerrymander than we have fought to hold the line. So here's an example. I'm sitting in Ohio. Our districting situation has been an absolute nightmare. The Ohio Republicans have violated the Ohio Constitution 8 times. They just won't follow the law. In New York, and I'm not criticizing this, when the Democrats basically gerrymandered New York, they followed the court order that struck their map down. And so their map got more fair. And you're supposed to follow court orders. I can't fault that. But in Ohio, they violated the court order over and over and over again until the time ran out. So they have an illegal map. The difference in this case between following the law and not following the law has benefited them. They're going to get more House seats because they broke the law. And that's why I say we have our courts, and any official that can exert accountability needs to see this is not the time to be passive, because until these people face accountability for law breaking and norm breaking at the polls and sometimes in court, they will keep going. So we've seen some gains due to reforms. We've seen some winning fights over gerrymandering, but they have benefited from a willingness to go further on the map, to fight for districting, for rigged districts than we ever would. And
is there any chance of being able to fight any of these
so here's
actions before the 2024 election?
Yes. In Ohio, we succeeded in changing our Constitution twice, and we elected 3 Democrats in 4 seats over 2 years to get ourselves a balanced Ohio Supreme Court. 3 of those seats are up this November. I'm working as hard as I can. If Democrats win those seats, even 2 of them, we have the majority of the Ohio Supreme Court. And that court could strike down more ridiculous maps before 24. So again,
Yeah.
I want Tim Ryan to win. I'm helping him. But I would also tell you there is no more important race in Ohio than the Ohio Supreme Court. And that's why I'm spending even more time on that, because most people aren't. So in Arizona, protecting democracy involves the state, not just Mark Kelly, but your races, and not letting Mark Finchem be a Secretary of State, because he's an election denier who I think would just make a mockery of the 24 election. So the challenge for all of us is it's not either or. We have to win the Senate seats, but it's and in different states, what are the other levers of power of democracy that in the past we've simply ignored, that we now have to pay attention to? In Ohio, that's the Ohio Supreme Court and some legislative seats. In Arizona, it's clearly Secretary of State and State House. We just have to do that everywhere. And that's why I'm so excited that you and other groups from the States Project are doing that.
Thank you.
And I saw Benet had a question in the chat. Did some of this start when Goldwater lost?
We have a repeated, really horrible cycle in this country of a white backlash whenever diverse democracy arises. This started when we founded ourselves, and it reappears every few generations when particularly African American voters begin to look as if they may control the fate of our country. And I go through this in my book, and I go through this often on my whiteboards. By the way, if you're on Twitter and you don't follow me at David Pepper, you may want to, because I'm always tweeting out stuff like this. The history of our country is so clear. By the way, this is why they want to censor it, that whenever there is a moment where diverse democracy arises, there is this fierce white backlash. It involves voter suppression, myths of voter fraud by voters people don't like, intimidation, violence, attacks on the rule of law, defiance of court orders. It happened after the Civil War when blacks started voting in the South, and it happened so effectively it led to Jim Crow. It happened after LBJ signed the Voting Rights Act, and it happened when Obama won. Not just because Obama himself was African American and historic, but because the Obama coalition, this diverse, broad, huge coalition, got its way. You saw the results in those state houses, and people who lost power and people threatened by the diverse democracy decided, like we've always seen in our history, we don't want that to happen. We're going to fight back. And so it's not even gold. It's a cycle. And the reason why the banning of history is so dangerous is what it's attempting to do is to blind ourselves of that cycle. And the fact that the key aspects of that cycle are always the same. It's always a myth of inappropriate voting. It's, again, defiance of law, just lawlessness. And too often it's violence. And once you shut our minds to that history, then what's happening now doesn't look nearly as bad as when you realize, oh, this is just what they did after the 1870s too. Or this is what they did after John Lewis and voting rights leaders succeeded in the 60s. It's the same pattern. It's our hit. And that's why part of my goal in that number one conclusion is all we are doing and you're doing, you are joining that long historic battle and seeing that that's the battle, and getting out of our sort of short kind of blinded view that we're in some like what John Lewis's quote there, that we're in some, automatically sort of heavenly democratic state that won't change. No, we're in a battle for democracy that we've always been in. And just because it's been relatively intact for 30 years, largely for white voters, don't for a second think that it's some nirvana that can't change. We have to see it as a deeper struggle, and it's always been a deeper struggle. And when you sign up to do what you're doing now, and also that's what you're in, and we have to see it that way. And it doesn't end either.
I want to take a second, and if you guys have other questions, please raise your hand or put it in the chat for David. We have about 7 more minutes with him. I don't want to keep him too late since he's over in Ohio. But one other area that the States Project reached out to us about a little over a week ago was actual postcarding for the state Senate candidates. And we adapted 300 people off their voter roll that they want us to reach out to. And this was for Lorena Austin and Seth Blotman. And we've actually gotten those through already. And I reached out and asked if they need help with anything else. And they said there's actually a very long list and they could use some more help getting those out. So if any of you are interested, I actually really enjoyed writing them. It was a lot of, for some reason, it was just really fun. And I felt that in my head. I'm like, I'm not just helping Lorena Austin and Seth Blotman here in the state Senate or state legislative race in Arizona, but I am lifting Mark Kelly and the other Democrats on the ticket. And so it just felt really empowering knowing that we're reaching out because I've never gotten a personal postcard. I don't think many people have for a state house candidate. And I was like, that's really cool. So they said they have a very long list. If anybody's interested, what I can do is adopt more of those voters for our group. And we have to get our own postcards for it, but I found some that you can get for $13 for a pack of 100 off Amazon, and they arrive the next day. So the fact that they want these to get turned around pretty quickly, if you're interested in downloading the postcards on your own, I can just email you the addresses. I think that'll be the quickest for these. So please let me know if anybody's interested in doing that.
Yeah, by the way, we had a big postcard effort around our Supreme Court race in 2020. And our candidate ended up winning by 10, even though Trump won by 8. It wasn't only because of those postcards, but when you blitz these places with personally written postcards, I think it really makes a difference. So anyone who can do that from afar, and I'm on phone calls a lot with these postcarders, and it's funny because usually their head, I'm only seeing their forehead because while we're speaking, they're literally writing their postcards. So there's some really dedicated postcard groups out there.
Perfect. Does anybody else have any other questions for David? David, thank you so much for joining us. I know it was a little difficult for you without your computer. You did a great job.
Yeah, I feel bad because I'm clearly not looking in the right place, so I apologize. But thank you for doing what you're doing. Stay in touch, and it really makes a difference. So I'm big fans of Stage Project, and I'm so glad you're tied into them.
Yeah, I heard you speak, David, at another group's event, like in February or March. It was a while ago, and I was immediately like, "How do I get in on this?" Like as I'm formulating our group here for Swing Left West Valley, I was like, "They're important partners." And
is that why had you not connected with Stage Project before that?
It was hearing you speak that I think
that's awesome.
mentioned them as a group to partner with, and I did. And then Melissa Walker came and joined us a while ago, and I keep telling everyone to listen to her podcast on Politics Girl. That was really good laying it out. And everybody, please follow David Pepper on Twitter. He does these whiteboard presentations where he'll go over these topics in a really easy to understand way. And I think it's really great that you're doing that. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Stay in touch. By the way, my email for anyone interested is davidpepper4ohio@gmail.com. If anyone ever has any, again, David Pepper, that's number 4ohio@gmail.com. Any groups, any questions, any advice, feel free to email.
And I'm happy to share it as well.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.
See ya. Bye-bye.
If anybody who wants to stay on, I'll talk to you guys about the postcarding since a few of you messaged me that you're interested. I'm going to sit because I'm a little tired. Sorry. I've been standing this whole time. If any of you are interested, probably the easiest is to email me, but I'm going to show you where to get the postcards real quick because they came from me overnight. It was very fast, so I can share that link with all of you. Where's the chat go? There it is. They have a few of them in there. I think it's on the one I got, but the shop had a few. They just said pick any other kind of vote postcards are good for them. And I mean, these come in groups of 100. The script's really easy. If you want, you can just email me. At my Swing Left email, which I just dropped in there. Most of you should have it because I probably emailed you all a gazillion times to remind you of the Zoom. But just tell me how many you think you want. I'll adapt those for you. I'll probably have them tomorrow. And I'll email you the script and go for it. I mean, honestly, like I added because it has a big, strong message about them being the only pro-choice candidates for the state legislature in that district. I got some fun little stickers and put them on mine that were kind of some feminist-looking stickers that just made it feel a little bit more fun for me. And yeah, and I'll just ask you to maybe email or text me when you're done with them so I can add them to our tally for our 10,000, because I do have a little running clipboard for my postcard so I can keep track of how many we've written, because it's fun to see that number go up. And yeah, and that's great. And then, like I said, I shared also the Giving Circle. If any of you are able to make a donation, it doesn't need to be a big one. And you can also share it with other people in your circle. And that's really what they encourage everybody to do to help raise money. Even if it's like, you know, everybody's giving $25 and you encourage 2 or 3 other people you know to do it. That's how you can raise that money quickly and help these down ballot candidates that clearly make a big impact. Does anybody else have any other questions about anything else from for our Swing Left West Valley group before we wrap up? I think we're good. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I hope I see a lot of you at our event this Sunday, October 2nd, with Ben Mysalis for our phone banking / letter and postcard writing event. Maybe I'll include a batch of these Arizona postcards for anyone that wants to tackle them there. Thank you.